Wow, it's been a hot week. Hope you've all had a good, if sweaty one. So this is the latest episode in our current box set series on Paul. I've been enjoying the talk so far, and I've loved the fresh perspectives that Owen's been bringing. This morning we'll be exploring the first letter to the Corinthians to understand more about this influential man and his message. So I've decided to call this talk The Rule of Love. I'm going to explore just a few of the points Paul makes, highlighting how he is guided in his advice by what he feels is the most gospel-oriented, loving response to the issues put to him. Now, in places, he adopts quite a tough love response, which we may want to push back on, due in part to cultural changes over the past 2 millennia. For instance, hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. Probably isn't a line you're going to hear if you're at one of 7 staff meetings. But can we push back on things we don't like in the Bible? Well, it's my conviction that God would rather we wrestle with it, and where we feel necessary, even disagree with Scripture, than just ignore it. There's too much treasure in this book, which we stand to miss out on if we're unwilling to wrestle through the difficult parts. Paul himself points out the extreme limitations of all our understanding in his famous love poem in chapter 13 of the letter. He likens his and our current understanding to that of a child, or to being like a distorted, dim reflection. We see in part. We see something, we do, but not the whole story. Not by a long shot. I passionately feel that if we want our Christian faith to continue growing and flourishing in the 21st century, we must treat the Bible as a living, organic thing that we can grapple with, as well as celebrate, shout at, as well as sing about. Otherwise, I think we're in danger of treating it like a static, dead fossil, fixed and hardened by the layers of time that have passed. So, to cover a whole letter like 1 Corinthians in a single talk is basically impossible. Its 16 chapters cover a diverse landscape of issues, each of which Paul tackles in some detail, and it would take double the time we have this morning just to read it. If you'd really like to get to grips with this or any of Paul's letters, I'd really recommend you watching a poster video on the Bible Project website, which is bibleproject.com. So, this letter is just part of an extended correspondence between Paul and a church he planted and spent 1.5 years living among. None of the Corinthians' own letters survive, and only 2 of Paul's 4 letters have made it. This is the first of his 2 surviving letters, and was probably written from Ephesus in response to issues raised by the Corinthian church, which they wanted Paul's direction on. So this is a little like eavesdropping one half of a conversation, which we're joining halfway through. Little wonder we've ended up with a spread of opinions on what it all means. You may have heard of Messy Church. Well, these guys took it literally. Their list of issues would make Jeremy Kyle raise his eyebrows. Here's a summary. We've got partisan factions fighting over whose celebrity leader was the best, rivaling interpretations of what behaviour and customs are in and out. We've got a bloke openly sleeping with his stepmom and apparently parading it as completely acceptable. Church members openly sleeping with shrine prostitutes and other instances of extramarital sex. There are lawsuits between church members. People arriving at church meetings in their factional groups and getting drunk on the Lord's Supper, while those in other groups go hungry. There are church members arrogantly showing off their spiritual gifts, like the ability to speak in tongues. Obnoxious prophets apparently talking over each other in their eagerness to be heard. And lastly, we've got theological division, with one section of the church even disputing teachings around resurrection. Crikey, it's quite a roll call. You can almost hear Paul drawing a deep breath before he begins his response. And again, time doesn't permit to go into any of these issues in any detail, but each one could be seen as symptoms of one singular, underlying failing. It is the failing that surely stands at the base of most of the problems of the human race suffers, and can be described as the me first syndrome. As we look at nature that surrounds us, the fastest, strongest, smartest, or most adaptable members of a species have the best chance of establishing and multiplying themselves. You don't have to watch much David Attenborough to see this pattern played out across the natural world. For much of its history, it seems, the human race has behaved in like manner. The richest, most violent, cunning, and powerful people groups have conquered, dominated, and often exploited those less well established. The winner takes it all. The loser has to fall. And so the story goes down through the centuries, from great empires of history all the way down to the ordinary family dinner table squabble, where so often it's the one with the sharpest tongue, the quickest mind, or perhaps the largest biceps who comes out on top. But at a critical point in history, Jesus enters the stage and reveals a way of living which flies in the face of all of this. It's completely counterintuitive and appears totally foolish to the status quo dog-eat-dog social setup. Jesus boldly claims it is not, in fact, a rich man's world. Now, the seeds of this revelation can be found laced throughout the Jewish scriptures. But Paul, in his letter, describes Jesus' message as being a message of wisdom among the mature, but not the wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are coming to nothing. No, we declare God's wisdom, a mystery that has been hidden and that God destined for our glory before time began. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. It's almost like there's a recipe for this strength in weakness revelation, which is spread out through the Hebrew writings, but it required Jesus to bring all the ingredients together before the penny would drop. He had to reveal the mystery in his flesh. As Paul notes in the passage just read, the Jews themselves were certainly not expecting a suffering. Indeed, they were expecting a conquering Messiah. So, Jesus and Paul's message at its core states that the human race has a higher responsibility and calling than mere control and domination. Petty-minded one-upmanship and insecure power-grabbing has no place in the expansive, abundant life our species was intended for. So back to our messy church. Jesus' mission to restore us to our true identity is not playing out so well among the Corinthians. Let's start with a quick, for instance, look at the partisan loyalties dividing the church into groups, each ascribing their loyalty to different celebrity leaders. Paul shoots this childish one-upmanship down with reference to the cross, essentially saying Jesus is your leader. So if you think life is just some sort of ego game, you've totally missed the point. The way of Jesus reveals that to be first and highest is to serve and love and prefer the needs of those around you. This is what leads to inner joy and peace, while also leading to a harmonious society. Paul downplays the role of the leaders they were putting on pedestals, saying, "What, after all, is Apollos? And what is Paul? Only servants, through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow." I congratulate any Liverpool supporters watching. Well done on winning the Prem. I know it's been a while. But as a Crystal Palace fan, I can be encouraged that it's not supporting the winning team that ultimately counts. Victory can be celebrated, and celebrated well, but it probably won't get you out of bed the next day. You'll have heard of the American swimmer Michael Phelps, who, having gained far more Olympic medals than any other swimmer in history, descended into a suicidal state. On the face of it, he'd achieved more than any professional swimmer in history could have dreamed of. But apparently, no amount of success in the pool could displace the longing he had for his father's love and approval. Okay, so victory can be hollow and success almost always carries a strange anticlimax. But how can the last actually be first, or the loser actually be the winner? Isn't this just doublespeak? Well, here's one thought. You see, the thing with failure is that it brings humility, and humility opens all sorts of very important doors to the soul. Perhaps the most vital of these is love. If I were to do an opinion poll right now of what you all thought gave life most meaning, I'm pretty sure the majority would say love. Arrogance, pride, envy, these all slam the door firmly shut on love, don't they? Contrastingly, suffering on any level and the settled peace and humility that can result from it through acceptance actually perfectly position us to love well. One of my current favourite writers, Richard Rohr, has written about learning sufferings, softening lessons. I'm sure you've all noticed that some of the most beautiful souls among us are those who have suffered greatly and suffered well. Indeed, it seems the adversity built into the fabric of life can either harden us or soften us. I know there is a hardness in me, which sadly causes those who don't know me well, and sometimes those who do, to give me a wide berth, to hesitate where otherwise they would advance. I believe this is largely because in my formative years I did not suffer well. I saw myself as weak and unintelligent in a very strong and sophisticated world. My response was to harden myself. I chose to pursue an inner independence and a self-made strength designed at protecting me from the hostility of life and to show them that I had what it takes. This is to suffer badly. The response Jesus modelled and commanded, however, was to embrace our cross, whatever actual shape that takes in our life. He teaches us not to run from adversity, but to trust him with it. Jesus didn't advocate masochism. He didn't want us to pursue suffering. But when it comes our way, he teaches us not to run from or harden ourselves against its impact, but rather to let it soften us. His grace can use our suffering to empower us to better receive his love and extend it to those around us. He can turn it on its head, life out of death. Is this not the message of the cross? I would strongly recommend Max Lucado's book, You Are Special. In this short story, Punchinello learns that both the stars and the spots that we're so keen to pin on one another, both our compliments and our criticisms, will fall away as we lean into the unconditional love of our Maker. This then in turn gives us an inner strength which will outstrip any we could have manufactured by ourselves. As David wrote, "Your gentleness has made me great." So much for partisan factions. Paul goes on to tackle a range of sexual issues that have arisen in the church, and in a manner that would make many contemporary leaders blush. Many of the issues raised could be said to have emerged from conflicting ethical standards, inherited from Greek and other cultures, colliding with that of the Jewish expats in the church. In the absence of so much of the law of Moses, what code or rule of behaviour should they apply? Well, Paul makes some suggestions, stroke commandments, but does so as he feels directed by the same rule of love that has driven everything else he's written. Our sex drives, Paul understands, are too powerful to sweep under the carpet. Their power to tear apart families, churches, and even whole communities, if mishandled, are so strong we ignore them at our peril. Our misuse of sex is even an offence to our own bodies. Paul writes, "Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. It seems clear from these chapters that aside from the temple prostitution and the man sleeping with his mother-in-law, there is a reasonable amount of extramarital sex happening, given his advice to those who are single and engaged. Some of the specifics of his advice will not, I'd argue, apply to us, such as his recommendation for those who are not currently engaged to stay single due to the present crisis. This is clearly time-bound advice, only relevant in their specific situation. But then on the other hand, the principle of, say, married partners each yielding their bodies to the other in mutual tender consent. This is a beautiful vision for sex and marriage. And as Owen pointed out last week, was incredibly progressive for his day, and if not ours. See, being sex positive doesn't mean we should adopt a carefree, anything goes approach. Surely this is being sex naive. Rather, surely we should hold it up as something precious and powerful, to be handled carefully and wisely. Paul instructs the exclusion of a man sleeping with his stepmom. Indeed, he says, do not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater or slanderer, a drunkard or swindler. Do not even eat with such people. See, his point here is that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough. And also further down the letter he writes, bad company corrupts good character. These are valid points. But then on the other hand, we're given Jesus' example of radical grace and inclusion. And we'd be justified in feeling that we ought to push back on this instruction. The truly wise and loving response to any issue will probably emerge as we bring two opposing but equally valid points together. On the one hand, love receives and includes, but on the other, it will also seek to protect against the spread of corruption through a community. Exactly how that is worked out in any given situation is down to the leadership and those directly involved. But the point I'm making is that the rule of love is fundamental to every decision, and the wisest solution will often not just be one copied and pasted lazily from one of Paul's letters, but rather one that honours the principles driving his and others' teachings. Does that make sense? I'll conclude this with a final example of Paul's rule of love approach to his messy church. In Paul's advice regarding eating or abstaining from meat sacrificed to idols, he validates both the views of those who believe it's wrong and those who believe it's okay, while ultimately agreeing with those who would say it's fine to eat a bacon sandwich even if it was sold at the temple of Aphrodite. He nevertheless strongly lays out that the rule of love should prevent them from indulging in their freedom in the presence of others in their community who would be scandalized by this behavior. For these people, Paul argues, if it offends their conscience, then for them it is wrong. He quotes their protest that, well, we have the freedom to do this. Paul nevertheless states that while it is permissible, their behaviour would not necessarily be beneficial to the broader community. They will not be acting lovingly to those who do not share their convictions. In the same way, it would not be loving for me to try to persuade, let's say, a vegan or a teetotaler that they're wrong, with perhaps some cheap line like, well, Jesus ate meat and drank wine. That's just not loving. And after all, I've learned from having listened to people representing both of these ethical positions, they have very good, Jesus-centered reasons for holding their views. Maybe I'm wrong. Life is just too complex and muddy for us all to agree, isn't it? So we are left to either form petty tribes, as the Corinthians seem to be doing, uniting with just those who agree with us on this or that matter, or we can listen to one another and, if needed, lovingly respect one another's views and agree to disagree. I had a real double take the other day. We were on a hike in the Lake District, and we're asking my daughter Hannah to do something she wasn't completely on board with. Her reply: "It's my choice. It's my life." She's 5. I shuddered. As Jesus followers, we can't in fact boast, as our broader culture often does, that I'm a free agent, able to make my own choices and live with the consequences. Because it's plainly not just us that has to live with them. And to love our neighbour is to let that affect our choices. Paul sums this all up by saying, no one should seek their own good, but the good of others. Inclusion of this final point, the fruit of this cooperation, if we can manage it, Paul describes, can be likened to the harmonious functioning of a human body, the parts of which are necessarily diverse, each with their own critical function, without which the whole would suffer. The foot should not strive to be a hand, and the head should not dismiss the importance of the feet. We're all needed, we're all important, we're all in. Well, I think I've run out of time. But how could I close without reading Paul's wonderful love poem, which needs neither explanation nor qualification? These words beautifully sum up the undergirding rule of love that has directed all of his advice through this and his other letters. You may want to close your eyes as I read this. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails.